to gather all these different thoughts that have been going through my head into one seamless whole. So I ask that you pray for me while we do that. So in our previous discussion of growing up, we have made two important statements. The first one is that you can trust God with your kids. Right? Amen. Sovereign in the mountain air, sovereign on the ocean floor, wherever God is sovereign, you can trust Him with your kids. And the second is every new generation must seek its own encounter with God. In other words, as you're growing up, you cannot necessarily live off your parents' faith for the rest of your life. You sooner or later have to decide on your own whether that's going to be part of it or not. Last Sunday night, in a small group gathered around a campfire, I asked for people to share how they had encountered God for themselves. The responses were very interesting. Now, in the morning message last week, I talked about how that church kids tend to grow up with two different worlds. There's their church world that they grow up in the early years, and then when they start getting a little bit older, they start discovering the worldly world. We could call that the secular, ungodly, and according to the flesh, fun world. And every teenager encounters that, and if you've grown up in church, you're probably like I was, growing up, and you have your church world that you're involved in, and you have your worldly world that you're involved in. The two things are a long ways apart, and it's really hard to reconcile between the two. Now, when I say secular, I don't necessarily mean that everything that's called secular is bad. Secular, does anybody know what that word even means? Secular just means non-religious. It's just not religious. It's not necessarily anti-religious. It's just not religious. And so everything in the world that we would call secular is not necessarily bad, but when you have a contest between secular and what I'm calling the churchy world, and what I mean by that churchy world is, let's just say you grow up and church, well, that's just what we do on Sunday. That's what our family does. You're not supposed to do these 4 or 5 big sins here and everything like that, and everything's just nice and churchy, but it's missing the power of God. And so if you grow up and you have a contest between your churchy world and the secular world, then I can guarantee the secular world is going to win every single time. Because a churchy world without God in it cannot compete with the secular world. The secular world has too much money, too much technology, too much stuff to grab your attention, too much stuff to keep you occupied. I laugh because there's a casino commercial on TV, and one of the lines that they say on that commercial is that it will keep you entertained for hours. And I thought to myself, that is just about exactly what it's come to, is we need to be entertained for hours. So even, just because something is secular doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but the reason that I say that a secular world is going to beat just a churchy world any day, I offer proof of that statement, this obvious fact. The secular world today is much worse than the secular world 50 years ago. Now, it's not that there's new sins. It's the same old sins, but they've been repackaged and they have been made much more available. A secular television show today has a great deal more blatant immorality than a secular show did 50 years ago. And if you watch the news, you will see that the secular world is moving more and more from non-religious to anti-religious. And so when the secular world beats the churchy world, then sooner or later you're going to have an ungodly world. You're going to have an addiction world. You're going to have an evil world that you are involved in. My wife was one of those who shared that night around the campfire. And her experience revealed an entirely different slant than the one that I've been talking about, because she didn't grow up in church. Her dad was an alcoholic. He was self-employed, so she would often go with him to work, and then on the way home from work, he would stop by the tavern just for one drink this time. And then that one would turn into another, into another, into another, and they would end up being there till late at night. And, you know, a tavern is really not the best place in the world for a 7 or 8-year-old girl to spend a lot of hours in it. But that's where she spent a lot of hours. And so she grew up in the worldly world without ever having the other. And she saw firsthand the devastation that world has to offer. Old drunk men making passes at an 8-year-old girl. Relatives who get drunk or high and molest. Car wrecks. Late night trips to bail dad out of jail. Fighting. Scars from fighting that still live there. She grew up and she experienced firsthand that the worldly world was not fun. When Satan starts trying to allure a young person into the world, he never shows what the end result of that fun will be. The end result of living life for the flesh is destruction, despair, and death. Yeah. It's broken relationships. It's broken health. It's lost jobs. It's poverty. And I can stand up here today and I can tell you that until I'm blue in the face, and you may or may not understand or receive what I'm saying. Because there are some things that you just have to find out for yourself. We would like to be people who learn the easy way, but often we're people that learn the hard way. Well, when she was growing up, she experienced that terrible side, and so by the time she was saved at the age of 10, she already knew the destruction and the devastation that comes about as a result of that lifestyle. And so when she was saved, for her, it was a real change. She had not developed all this other stuff that I had developed as I was a kid through probably basically my own fault. But when she continued to go to church after she became a Christian, and she started getting to know some of the other kids and the teenagers there at church, she was kind of shocked, because this was your stereotypical youth group. Not really all that interested in listening to the sermon, passing notes, making jokes, trying not to laugh out loud, but not being very successful. You know how it works, don't you? Don't you know how that works? Now, if it were today, of course, what you would have is they'd be, hiding over their phones so nobody could see their texting the whole time. So it'd be a little quieter today. But anyway, she was shocked because in her mind, the greatest news that has ever been spoken was being preached, and those kids didn't even care. And she couldn't understand, because she thought that they must have had an advantage growing up in church, and here they didn't even act like it meant anything to them. So, is it actually more advantageous to not grow up in church? Absolutely not. The church kids still have the advantage because they have all those years of learning the scriptures and being taught principles. Hopefully, if they're in a Bible teaching church, that they're going to learn at least some things. And there is no minimum age requirement on having a life-changing encounter with God. But when you develop the powerless churchy world, God sometimes has to grab you and shake you out of it so that He can become your world. That happened to me whenever I got out on my own. I was already preaching when I got out on my own, but God still had to shake me a little bit. I was still stuck in that churchy world without it being a God world. I hope you don't think that I'm running down things like growing up in church and the things that we do in church. I'm not running that down any at all. What I am speaking against is when people have that, but they really don't have God as the center of their lives. And I'm going to tell you, parents, something here, and I hope that you'll take it in the spirit that I mean it, because this is simply the result of many surveys that have done about kids that grow up in church and then leave church when they are grown up. They did these studies 40 years ago, they did these studies 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and they're still doing them today. And every time this is done, the number one reason why a young person that becomes an adult and stops going to church is because they grew up in a family where church was done on Sunday, but the spiritual attitude was completely lukewarm for the rest of the week. The parents did not really live out their faith. Kids who did not grow up in church at all and who had addicts for parents actually had a higher success rate of staying in church than did kids with parents who went to church every Sunday, but it didn't mean anything. So you can take that for what it's worth. I'm not pointing any fingers at anybody this morning, but I think that we all ought to know that and to understand it. The other stories that were told around the campfire that night were all different. There were people who had been raised in church, people who had not been raised in church, but in every single one of the stories that were told around the campfire, every one of them had one thing in common. And I think that this common experience was not just coincidental. In other words, it wasn't just a happenstance that there happened to be, several people in one place that had the same story. I actually believe that if you took a poll of every committed adult Christian today, a Christian with a true God world who understands and follows God, that every single one of them would have a line in their testimony that goes something like this: God, I can't do it anymore. I can't handle this anymore. I must have you, or I will have nothing at all. Every single person who shared that night had a line like that in there, that they came to that point where they said, God, I can't do this anymore. I wanted to find some biblical examples of that kind of desperation, and I found more than I can use. So what I decided to do was, I decided to use Jacob as an example for this. One, because this particular story illustrates the point really, really clearly. And the other reason is because Ray was asking about this here a few weeks ago. And so I decided to do that just for you, Ray.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We are in the book of Genesis, and it's going to be chapter 32. Jacob, Abraham's grandson, had twice tricked his older brother. He had twice manipulated his older brother Esau. The first time out of his birthright, and the second time out of his blessing. The Hebrew name actually means deceiver. And so after these had happened and he became in fear of his older brother Esau, he fled north to a place called Padanaram, where he met Laban and married Laban's two daughters, because Laban tricked him into marrying both of them. He only loved one of them, but Laban tricked him into marrying them both. He continued to work for Laban for several years, and after that he had acquired much livestock, and so he decided that it was time for him to go back home, and so he was returning to the land of Canaan. 2 wives, 11 kids, who knows how many herd of livestock. His 12th kid hadn't been born yet. And he hears that Esau is coming his way with 400 men mounted on horses. Jacob is filled with fear. He is so afraid that he decides to divide his company into two. One company with each wife, thinking that if Esau attacked one of them, then the other one might escape. And so he sent both of those companies across. There was a stream that they had to cross on their way, and he sent them both across the stream, but he stayed back, and he was left alone back on the other side of the stream at night. Now, this is a very strange passage of Scripture. I'll just tell you that ahead of time. So, understand that it was written 3,400 years ago, and, language has changed a bit since then, and, just keep that in mind. I still think, though, that we can have a pretty good explanation and that we can take this passage quite literally. Genesis 32, beginning with verse 24. Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. As we go through this passage, we are going to find out that that man was none other than the pre-incarnate Christ. That this man was God. Jacob was wrestling with God. Now I realize that seems strange, but maybe after we have gone through this, you'll understand just a little bit better. When he saw, that is, when God saw that he had not prevailed against him, Jacob. Now I know that sounds strange. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh, so the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Now, is it really possible that Jacob was so strong that he could match God in a wrestling match? No. We all know that's not possible. This entire encounter was engineered by God in order to accomplish something in Jacob's life and to bring Jacob to a place where he realized his own desperation and sought for him who is the only answer to that desperation. In other words, God was letting him prevail. When I was a kid, my next older brother was 5.5 years older than me, and we would go out and play football out in the yard. And I would be 8 and he would be 13. And obviously, he could dominate that game if he wanted to. But sometimes he would let me get away from him just so that I could score a touchdown. That's kind of what God was doing here. He was letting Jacob prevail. He was letting Jacob hang on. All right, let's continue reading. Then he, God, said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But he, Jacob, said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he, God, said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Now I told you that Jacob, the name Jacob means deceiver. The name Israel means perseverant. He who perseveres. Now some of you who have studied before are probably thinking, I thought the name Israel meant prince. Well, it does. But it means prince as a derivative of the original. And so the idea here is that because you have prevailed with God, you will also prevail with men. Or, as he says, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So God changes his name from deceiver to perseverant prince. Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" In other words, you should know it. And he blessed him there. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, but God did something in the newly named Israel's heart that touched him to his deepest heart. he blessed him. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. We can learn at least 4 things from this passage. Yes, I'm going to be a real preacher today and actually give you 4 whole points instead of just 1 like I've been doing. Number 1, God will take you to desperation in order to open your eyes to Him. Have you ever thought about that? That God will take you to desperation if that's necessary? Now, there are some wannabe theologians in the world who would say, well, God will not actually take you to a place of desperation. He might just not stop you from taking yourself there. They say that because they feel like they have to keep God in this tiny little box of understanding that they get. And so they have the idea that God would never deliberately lead you to desperation because, well, that would not be loving. It is loving. So let me assure you that God can and will take you to a place of desperation. All right? And now that leads me to my second point. You're feeling better now because it didn't take very long for point 1. Now we're already on point 2. When God takes you to desperation, it is an act of grace. He doesn't do it because He doesn't like you, and He doesn't do it to punish you. You know, a child of God never receives punishment from Him. We receive discipline, but we don't receive punishment. The difference? Punishment is given in order to make you pay for what you did. Discipline is given in order to correct you. So, it may sound bad, but God is good. God had engineered this event with Jacob so that he could wrestle with him that night, and Jacob persevered because he was so desperate. You know, I have said to the Lord on many occasions, if you are not with me, I do not even want to go one more step. I can tell you that it usually takes a lot of pain to get to that point. And God uses desperation in our lives to call us to His side. There have been countless nights that I have wet my pillow just crying out to God, saying, God, I have to have you. It seems like in the last 4 months that's happened a little bit more often than normal. But I'll tell God, I don't have it in me to preach one more sermon. I don't have it in me to sing one more song. I don't have it in me to talk with one more person. If I don't have you, I don't have anything. God, I must have you. I must know your presence. Now, the reason that I say that this is an act of grace is because God has to break down all of our belief in ourselves. I'm not suicidal, but if God called me home today, I probably wouldn't complain. You've heard the saying, I want to go to heaven, but I don't want to go today. I don't think I would complain. Even the Apostle Paul felt that way. If you think that I'm morbid, even Paul felt that way. He said it would be so much better for me to go on and be with Christ than to stay here. But then he said, but it's better for you that I stay. This is Paul speaking to the people he's writing to. And so I know that God's not finished with me yet, or I would already be gone. And since God is not finished with me yet, then I am going to be willing to stay until He is finished. Because I don't want to cut short anything that He wants to do in my life and through me. But that still doesn't always make me feel better. As long as there's one little thought in our minds that we can do something alone, we will never abandon ourselves to the power of God. Until we abandon to the power of God, we do nothing. If God did not take us to that place, He would actually be unloving and unmerciful. So, when God takes you to desperation, it is an act of grace in your life. Number 3, God may take you to desperation so deep that you will not let go of Him. I do not know the exact nature of Jacob's experience that night. I don't know if there was a literal bodily form of appearance of God, or if this whole thing took place in Jacob's spirit. It doesn't really matter. Either way, it would be just as real. I tend to think that it was a literal bodily form that God took. There's no reason to not think that. But whatever it was, we see that Jacob was at that desperation point. And don't you know that God pushed the envelope just a little bit? I mean, it wasn't like He was just going to lay down and let Jacob take it. I mean, I think God made Jacob fight with all of his strength and with all of his endurance, don't you? Yeah. That was still easy for him. But it says that he did that all night long. I used to enjoy wrestling with my sons. And I took a little bit of that kind of stuff when I was younger, so I have a couple of little sneaky techniques, and I can still out wrestle them if the match only lasts 30 seconds. But if it goes any longer than 30 seconds, I'm done. My goose is cooked. An old man now. Jacob wrestled with God all night long. I don't think God gave him a break. I don't think God said, hey, let's take 5. Go get a Coke. He wrestled all night long. And what that tells you, what it tells me, is that Jacob was so desperate for God at this point. Yes, he had got to that point through worldly circumstances, through the fear of his brother Esau, the last several years of being tricked by his father-in-law, of having his wages changed 10 times, the Bible says, of all things, yet still God blessed him with all this stuff. And can you imagine making a journey on foot with 2 wives, 11 kids, who knows how many hired hands, and who knows how many head of livestock? And you're just taking the whole batch and you're just moving it. That would be a headache. But now he's got the fear of Esau coming. And all he can think about is that Esau must be seeking revenge. I'll go ahead and tell you, when he did meet Esau, everything turned out really great. But Jacob didn't know that. So Jacob to that, and I think sometimes it's a circumstantial thing that drives us to that. Maybe it is what's going on in your life, or your spouse's life, or your children's life, or your parents' life, or what's going on at work. But eventually, it's going to come down to the fact that you have a place in your heart that only God can fill, and you're sick and tired of trying to fill it any other way. So, point number 4 is the more desperate that we become, the more we realize that it is God's face that we seek, not just His hand. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are times when we are just looking for God's hand. In other words, God, you're powerful, will you fix this? God, will you provide this? Will you do this for me? That's seeking His hand. But seeking His face is something completely different, isn't it? Because if somebody's talking to you and you look at them in the face, you get a lot more information than if you just hear the words, right? Yeah. I mean, they say that when one person is communicating to another one, that only about 39% of the entire message consists of the words that are spoken. The rest of it consists of the facial expression and the tone of voice and the body language. So, when we want to see God's face, we're not just wanting Him to do something, but we're wanting to see His heart. We're wanting to see His face so that we can see that He loves us. We're wanting to see His face so that we can see His intention. We want to see His face so that we can know Him. I honestly have come to the place where the miracle of knowing God's presence in my life is more important than any miracle of provision or healing has ever been. And that is what it has taken for me to move into a true God world. I still have a church world, and I'm not ready to give it up. I like it. But without a God world, it would be nothing at all. I think a lot of other people have this experience. When I'm not really taking the time to seek His face, or if for some reason I do not feel like I am experiencing very much, I feel incredibly alone. Now, I know that God has never left me alone. So you don't have to come up to me after church and say, "Now, Jeff, you know God says you'll never be alone." I know that. And I believe that. I will never leave you or forsake you. But sometimes the feelings don't go along with what we know is the truth. And sometimes I feel a very deep emptiness of aloneness whenever I don't think that I'm experiencing God the way I would like to. And I think that God engineers that too, because what He really wants to do is He wants to fill us with Himself. He wants to fill us with His joy. He wants to bring us joy and an experience of Him more than we want it from Him. But sometimes He simply has to bring us to the point where we're ready for that. Ready to want what He wants for us. Ready to receive what He wants to give us. Because the gift is so good that we can't imagine it unless God prepares us for it. I think heaven's that way too. I think one of the reasons why we go through things in this life is to prepare us for heaven. And Paul said that the trials of this life, that they don't even hold a candle to the glory of heaven. And so one of the reasons I think that we experience this is to prepare us for heaven. You know, it might be that if everything was so easy down here, then we might not appreciate it quite as much. All right, now that is the message. That's the message. But very quickly, I want to apply it to a couple of relevant issues. I really haven't talked about Thanksgiving today, and I really haven't talked about growing up very much today. So, very, very quickly, I want to apply what we have talked about just a little bit to those two things. The transition from childhood to adulthood and how it affects both the kids and the parents is something that this issue speaks to in a great deal. One of the most difficult things for parents to accept is that this process is going to happen in your kids. It's hard to accept that. And I think a great deal of what we call parenting is trying to stand as a shield between our children and consequences, or as a shield between our children and desperation or devastation. And that's not wrong. God put that in us for a reason, because we have to get them grown, you know. We have to keep them alive until they can keep themselves alive. And so that's really a God-given thing. And some parents are going to overreact to that statement, try to let it go too soon. He made his bed, he can sleep in it. How old is he again? 4. Got to learn to swim sometime, throw him in the pool. What's all those sharks doing in there? Yeah. So there's definitely an overreaction to that, but at the same time, on the opposite end of that, there is a parent who attempts too long in their child's life to be a buffer zone, to be a shield from a person getting to this point. And so we need to really know and understand that just as that happened with you and I, it's also going to happen with them. The best thing that we can do, and the one thing we can do that might truly make it a little easier for them, is to remember and to understand what it's like when we went through it, or if we're going through it right now, and to share that and be open with that so that we can give them instruction and to guide them as they go through it. Don't try to protect them and keep them from going through it. Help them through it. It's a lot different. A lot different. Maybe they will be able to learn the lesson a little easier. Or then again, maybe not. The second relevant issue is that this is supposed to be a Thanksgiving Day message, right? Right. And I have spent hardly any time on that theme. But the Scripture tells us to be thankful in how many things? Oh. You mean the kind of things that I've been talking about this morning? Yeah. See, here's the essence of Thanksgiving. And this is why we like the warm, fuzzy Thanksgiving ideas, because we know that God is good. We know that God has blessed us with many things. I mean, if, most of us, actually all of us, are in the top 1% of wealth as far as the average person in the world goes. Not the United States, but when you compare us to the rest of the world, every one of us are in the top 1% financially. No, this is not a commercial for the 99. We have homes, we have vehicles, we have cell phones, we have food. Tonight we're going to have a feast because God has provided for us so much. Yes, a lot of times we're really, really tight from week to week. But still, we've got so much. And so, what we're supposed to do is we're supposed to sit back and we're supposed to count our blessings, and we're going to say, boy, we don't have it so bad. We really got it good. Oh, God, thank you. Sorry that I was feeling bad. Please forgive me. But I think that the more deep Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving that actually sets us even more straight on the path, is when we learn to say, well, God, it's not going so good. I'm feeling bad. I'm feeling desperate. I'm feeling like I've got to have you. And I've got a lot of pain. But I trust you. Because you know what faith says when you are in a really deep time? This is what faith says when you're in a deep time. Faith says, I believe that God knows what He's doing, and that God has my absolute best concern in His mind and heart. And He would not have put me in this situation if He did not plan to use this situation for a greater good. Maybe soon, maybe later, I don't know, but I trust Him. I heard a song several years ago. I've been trying to find it. I haven't recently, but the title of it is, When You Can't Trace His Hand, Trust His Heart. And that's what faith tells us. And so faith gives us the ability to be thankful for what we don't see. Yes, we should be much more thankful for what we do see. But faith gives us the ability to be thankful for what we do not yet see. Knowing that the future holds nothing but ultimate good. That God is doing this for a reason. And we can thank Him for it.